March 1967. The war in Vietnam had entered its most paradoxical phase. American air power dominated the skies by every measurable metric: payload, radar range, sortie rate, logistics. And yet, something was slipping through the cracks. Over the Gulf of Tonkin, radar operators had begun reporting contacts that made no sense. Aircraft that appeared briefly, violated restricted airspace, and vanished without engaging. Not MiGs, not bombers. Something heavier, slower, foreign. At Gia Lam Air Base, outside Hanoi, a captured aircraft sat beneath camouflage netting, its aluminum skin still bearing fresh scorch marks from anti-aircraft fire. It was an American aircraft, unmistakably so. A U.S. Navy A-6 Intruder, downed 3 weeks earlier during a night strike mission. Its crew had ejected. The aircraft had not burned. That alone made it priceless. For the North Vietnamese, the Intruder was not a trophy. It was currency. Within days, Soviet advisors arrived under the pretense of technical assistance. They did not ask permission. They never did. The aircraft was disassembled piece by piece under armed guard, loaded into unmarked crates, and quietly moved north by rail. By the time American intelligence confirmed the loss was irrecoverable, the Intruder was already crossing the Chinese border. Its destination was never written down. Officially, the aircraft ceased to exist. July 1967. Zhukovsky Airfield, outside Moscow. Colonel Viktor Semyonovich Baranov stood at the edge of Hangar 47, watching the crates being unloaded. Baranov was not a politician, nor a propagandist. He was a test pilot, one of the last of a dying breed who had flown aircraft designed by men who believed intuition mattered as much as mathematics. He had flown MiG-15s in Korea. He had buried friends who trusted numbers more than instincts. When Moscow called him back from semi-retirement, he knew the request would not be routine. Inside the hangar, Soviet engineers worked in near silence. The crates were opened carefully, almost reverently. Piece by piece, the American aircraft emerged, swept wings folded for carrier operations, a bulbous fuselage packed with electronics, a cockpit that looked more like a command center than a fighter. Baranov circled it slowly. "So this," he muttered, "is how they fight at night." The A-6 Intruder was unlike anything the Soviet Union operated. It was not fast. It was not elegant. But it was dense, thick with systems, wiring, black boxes, terrain-following radar, all-weather attack capability. A machine designed not to win dogfights, but to penetrate defended airspace regardless of conditions. A young engineer broke the silence. "Comrade Colonel, it weighs more than 2 MiG-21s combined." Baranov smiled thinly. And yet it flew from a ship, into a storm, through missiles, and almost made it home. That was the contradiction Moscow wanted explained. 3 days later, Baranov sat in a windowless room beneath the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute. Around him were men who rarely agreed on anything: radar specialists, avionics engineers, air defense officers, and a single KGB observer who never spoke. The briefing was blunt. "The Americans have built an aircraft that ignores our strengths," one general said. "It does not outrun us. It does not outclimb us. It simply arrives." Slides flickered across the wall. Radar schematics. Wiring diagrams painstakingly reconstructed from salvaged components. The Intruder's navigation system could map terrain in darkness and weather that grounded Soviet strike aircraft entirely. Baranov listened without comment. Finally, the general turned to him. "Colonel Baranov, you will fly it." There it was. No question. No discussion. Baranov nodded slowly. When it is ready. And when you are prepared to forget everything you know about American incompetence." That earned a few uneasy smiles. The cockpit shocked him. Baranov had expected chaos, labels in English, systems layered without logic. Instead, he found discipline. Every display served a purpose. Every switch was reachable without strain. 2 crew stations sat side by side, pilot and bombardier navigator, sharing information constantly. "This is not a fighter," he said aloud. "This is a thinking machine." The manuals, translated overnight by exhausted linguists, were thick, absurdly thick by Soviet standards. Where a MiG manual told you what to do, the American manual explained why. Baranov did not like that. Machines, in his experience, should obey, not argue. Still, as he strapped in, he felt something unfamiliar: curiosity without contempt. The engine spooled up with a low, confident hum. Not the raw scream of a Timansky turbojet, but a controlled, dampened sound. The aircraft did not feel alive. It felt patient. Taxiing was effortless. The nose wheel responded smoothly, almost gently. This was an aircraft designed to be flown tired, at night, under stress. At the runway threshold, Baranov paused. For the first time in years, he felt no urge to test the machine. No instinct to provoke it. The intruder did not demand dominance. It demanded cooperation. Interesting, he whispered. He advanced the throttles. The takeoff was uneventful. No leap, no surge, just steady acceleration and lift, like a cargo aircraft with delusions of grandeur. Baranov frowned. Any MiG pilot would have already been climbing aggressively, searching for advantage. At altitude, the intruder revealed its secret. The radar came alive. Terrain unfolded beneath him in luminous detail. Hills, valleys, rivers rendered in ghostly clarity despite solid cloud cover. Baranov flew blind by eye, omniscient by instrument. This, he said into the recorder, is not flying. This is infiltration. He imagined it now. Dozens of these aircraft slipping beneath radar, ignoring weather, ignoring darkness, arriving over targets thought unreachable. Not faster than defenses, smarter than them. At low altitude, the aircraft was rock solid. Where Soviet strike aircraft shuddered and protested, the intruder absorbed turbulence with indifference. It did not fight the air. It negotiated with it. But there were weaknesses. The aircraft was vulnerable if surprised. Heavy, slow to accelerate, dependent on systems. If its electronics failed, it became blind and deaf. Baranov smiled grimly. Everything has a price. After landing, the engineers swarmed the aircraft. Data was extracted, recorded, analyzed. Moscow would have its answers. But Baranov remained seated long after the engines shut down. Because the question had changed. The Americans had not built a perfect aircraft. They had built a contextual one. A machine shaped entirely around how they intended to fight. At night, far from home, with logistics assured. The Soviets, he realized, built aircraft for collapse. For scarcity. For improvisation. Neither philosophy was wrong. But they were incompatible. That night, Baranov wrote his preliminary assessment. The intruder represents a dangerous evolution. Not in speed or firepower, but in indifference to conditions. It assumes the world will be hostile and flies anyway. He closed the folder and marked it top secret. The aircraft would never be acknowledged publicly. Officially, it would be dismantled, studied, and forgotten. Unofficially, it had already done its damage. Because somewhere between Hanoi and Moscow, the Americans had lost more than an aircraft. They had revealed how they truly fought wars. The following weeks turned the captured aircraft from an anomaly into a problem. Not a technical one. Those were being solved methodically, but a doctrinal one. Soviet air defense officers requested simulations. What would happen, they asked, if such an aircraft approached not Hanoi, but Minsk, Kiev, Moscow itself? The question was never written down, but it hung in every room where the intruder's data was projected onto concrete walls. Baranov was ordered back into the cockpit repeatedly. Day flights, night flights, poor weather, deliberate system failures. Engineers pulled circuit breakers mid-flight without warning. Radar operators jammed signals. Navigators fed false terrain data into the system. Each time, the aircraft degraded, but it did not fail catastrophically. It became clumsier, more limited, but still controllable. Still flying. That disturbed people. In one test, ground controllers deliberately withheld guidance, simulating a breakdown in command structure. Soviet doctrine relied on centralized control. Pilots executed orders. This aircraft, however, seemed designed for autonomy. Even isolated, it retained a kind of stubborn competence. After one such flight, a young major from the Air Defense Forces spoke out of turn. "Comrade Colonel," he said, "this aircraft assumes its command will be destroyed." The room fell silent. No one corrected him. Baranov's report grew thicker. He stopped describing systems and began describing implications. The intruder, he wrote, was not built to win air superiority. It was built to exploit the moment when superiority no longer mattered. When radars were saturated. When defenses were confused. When weather grounded interceptors. It was a weapon for the second act of war. That conclusion did not please Moscow. A closed meeting followed. No transcripts, no recordings. Baranov was present, along with 2 generals, 3 designers, and 1 man introduced only as Comrade S. The tone was cautious, almost polite, which Baranov recognized as dangerous. The Americans rely too much on electronics, one general insisted. This aircraft is fragile. Baranov responded calmly. Yes, but it is fragile in the same way a watch is fragile. Break 1 gear, it stops. But until then, it tells time better than a hammer. Another officer scoffed. Are you suggesting we copy this? No, Baranov replied. I am suggesting we understand it. Comrade S finally spoke. His voice was soft. Understanding is not neutral, Colonel. It leads to conclusions. Baranov met his gaze. So does ignorance. The meeting ended without resolution. Not long after, the aircraft was flown against simulated Soviet defenses. Old systems, new systems, everything the Union trusted to guard its airspace. The results were classified immediately, but among those who saw them, a consensus formed quietly and without enthusiasm. The aircraft did not guarantee success, but it increased probability. Enough to matter. It could not survive in daylight against alert interceptors, but at night, in weather, against fixed assumptions, it slipped through more often than anyone liked. Engineers began asking uncomfortable questions about Soviet strike doctrine. Why did their aircraft require ideal conditions? Why was night still treated as a limitation rather than an advantage? Why was complexity seen as weakness rather than leverage? Those questions went unanswered. In October 1967, orders came down to end flight testing. The official reason was sufficient data collected. Unofficially, the aircraft had become too persuasive. It challenged not just designs, but beliefs. Baranov was summoned one final time. He stood beside the intruder as technicians prepared it for disassembly. Panels were removed. Wiring cut. The aircraft that had crossed continents in secret was being reduced to components again. You seem dissatisfied, an officer remarked. Baranov shook his head. No, I am disappointed. There is a difference. Because we are not adopting it. Because we are pretending it teaches us nothing. The officer smiled thinly. We have our own philosophy. Yes, Baranov said. And so do they. That is the problem. The intruder never flew again in Soviet markings. Its parts were distributed to institutes. Its systems copied selectively, cautiously. Nothing whole survived. Officially, the aircraft never existed. The North Vietnamese were thanked. The Americans never learned its fate. But Baranov changed. He continued flying Soviet aircraft, but he no longer believed in inevitability. He saw how doctrine shaped machines, and how machines, in turn, shaped expectations. He understood now that wars were not decided by who had better aircraft, but by who anticipated the wrong conditions better. Years later, when asked in private what the most dangerous American aircraft he had ever encountered was, he did not name a fighter. He described a heavy, slow attack plane that assumed the world would be broken and flew anyway. Time moved forward the way it always does after war, unevenly, selectively, remembering what was convenient and burying what was not. Vietnam ended without resolution, only exhaustion. Files were sealed, personnel reassigned, lessons quietly mislabeled as anomalies. Yet within the Soviet aviation and air defense community, the shadow of the captured American aircraft remained, not as a blueprint, but as a doubt that refused to fade. Baranov continued his work as a consultant long after his official authority diminished. Younger officers respected him not because he held rank, but because he had seen something they had not. In closed rooms, away from recorders and minutes, he was asked the same question repeatedly, phrased in different ways. What frightened you about it? Each time, his answer disappointed them. He never spoke of performance, never of radar resolution or navigation accuracy. He spoke instead of intent. That aircraft, he said once, assumes the world will be hostile, damaged, and indifferent, and it flies as if that is normal. This was not how Soviet doctrine thought about war. Doctrine assumed disruption as a phase, something to be overcome so that order could be restored. The intruder assumed disruption as a constant. It did not wait for clarity. It operated inside confusion and treated it as terrain. In internal papers, carefully worded to avoid ideological contamination, this was described as Western operational pragmatism. In margins, handwritten by engineers who understood the implication, it was described more honestly: preparation for failure. One classified exercise in 1973 tested a hypothetical scenario derived from the intruder's profile: a limited conflict, partial communications loss, weather degradation, fragmented command. The conclusions were never formally published. Instead, the exercise was quietly archived and its parameters discouraged from reuse. It had produced too many uncomfortable outcomes. Baranov read the summary anyway. The modeled adversary did not win through superiority. It survived through continuity. While defenses waited for coordination, it acted. While doctrine searched for certainty, it exploited ambiguity. The scenario did not end in defeat, but it did not end in control either. For a system built on predictability, that was worse. When Baranov retired completely, he took nothing with him. No documents, no souvenirs, only memory. He settled into a small apartment and watched the world change faster than anyone had expected. The Union dissolved. Flags were lowered. Assumptions collapsed. In that collapse, he saw the final irony. The Soviet system had been designed for endurance under pressure, yet it was the weight of its own certainty that broke it. The Americans, whom they had accused of technological arrogance, had built machines that assumed fragility, not just of hardware, but of plans, hierarchies, and people. Years later, in a rare interview with a Western journalist researching Cold War aviation myths, Baranov was asked if the story of the captured American aircraft was true. He paused for a long time before answering. "Yes," he said finally, "but not in the way you want it to be." The journalist pressed him. "Did it change anything? Did it influence Soviet design? Did it alter strategy?" Baranov smiled faintly. "It changed how some of us thought. That is always the slowest change and the hardest to measure." He explained that nations rarely learn from their enemies directly. Pride filters perception. What they learn instead comes indirectly, through adaptation, through quiet borrowing, through denial softened into habit. By the time influence is visible, its origin is forgotten. Machines, he added, outlive doctrines. But ideas outlive machines. After the interview, he walked alone along a riverbank, watching aircraft contrails fade into cloud. Modern jets now carried more computing power than entire Cold War command centers. They were faster, smarter, more connected. And yet, he wondered if they were prepared for the same question the intruder had posed decades earlier. What happens when the network fails? What happens when the plan dissolves? What happens when you are alone in hostile air, with no guidance, no certainty, and no time? The intruder had answered that question not with brilliance, but with stubborn functionality. Baranov died quietly not long after. His personal papers contained no revelations. Only a single notebook, mostly empty. On the last page, written in careful, aging script, was one sentence: "Victory belongs not to the strongest system, but to the one that expects to break and continues anyway." The notebook was catalogued, stored, and forgotten. And somewhere between history and silence, the lesson remained, unclaimed, unresolved, waiting for the next war to rediscover it the hard way.